Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Maartje.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This is the second part of our two-part episode on myth-making in World War II. We are super fortunate to have our guest Sam back, and we've been having some really good discussions on this topic, so I'm excited to continue.
Welcome back, Sam.
Hello.
We have talked at length about American war media, and specifically the ones that we are big fans of. But we also wanted to talk about other war media from other countries. And I think just because of who we are and where we're from, we're probably going to mostly focus on Dutch, Filipino, and Canadian war media, but we may touch on others if we get there. So I wonder, maybe each of us can talk a little bit about like our national myth making as pertains to World War II. Like, what are people's perceptions of what happened in World War II? And if you have any like movies or books that you want to bring up, like definitely go for it.
When you look at the Netherlands, we have a couple of war movies, but we're very direct, no-nonsense kind of people. So most of our war movies are nuanced, which I didn't really think about until we started watching them for this podcast. But one of the myths that's often believed about the Dutch in World War II. I've mentioned it before. We like to think that we were all opposed to Germany, and we really weren't. There was a lot of anti-Semitism going on in the Netherlands at the time of the war. A lot of people wanted a better life. We've talked about this on another podcast, so I won't go on to it for very long. I want to say that's the biggest one, is the one where we say we were all victims to the Germans and we were all just trying to get by, while many people actually agreed with the Germans. The other one might be that the resistance had this big impact on the outcome of the war. And these stories are often played up in the movies, and they're like these big heroes, and they definitely were brave and they helped quite a lot. And the people that were in the resistance were definitely very brave. I just feel like sometimes they're turned into these larger than life stories, and they really weren't. Like, resistance was often found in the small things, and those were important in keeping people safe and giving people shelter or food or anything like that. But if I had to recommend to you a series that I really enjoyed about resistance, it would be A Small Light, which is not a Dutch series, but it is about a Dutch woman called Mythmaking, who had a part playing Anne Frank's story, and it's a part we don't hear as much about, which is what makes it so interesting. But other than that, I don't think there are that many myths about the Dutch in World War II, because our military wasn't as big a part of it, because we were occupied. So I would like to pass the baton to Sam to tell us about Canada.
There's this interesting thing where we've talked about this on a previous pod, but after World War I, when the Statute of Westminster was passed, which gave Canada control over its own foreign affairs, there has been this recent national need or desire, I guess, to cast World War I as the quote-unquote Canadian War of Independence. That was really the first time where we became a major force on the world stage. There are battles that became quite famous, like Vimy Ridge. There's an enormous memorial in France at Vimy Ridge. And basically the idea is that the land around the memorial is Canadian soil because they took that land and hold it still. And so a huge part of the Canadian national identity are these World War I battles, you know, the Passchendaels and the Somme and all this. And then after that, of course, we became in charge of our own foreign policy, and then World War II happened. But I think that kind of similar to the Americans, we have this view of World War II that we all banded together and everybody did their bit and this and that. A much more rosy picture, much more nostalgic picture than I'm sure what was actually the case at the time. But for us, really, like World War I is our myth-making war. And then World War II as a consequence of that later on. But we, as I said earlier, we don't really have a substantial film industry. The one that we do have is very like small and vibrant and important, but we're not really out here making a ton of war movies. There are a small handful of Canadian World War II movies, but you haven't seen them. And so it's really not a part of our, I guess, national myth in this way that it is in the United States. And I think in Canada in the 60s and 70s, that really became the time when we started to grapple with this idea that we didn't really have a national identity and that so much of our national culture was sort of soaked up through osmosis from the United States or came to us from the United Kingdom or in English Canada or France for French Canadians. During the 60s and 70s, we started to be like, all right, well, all these new pieces of like theater started coming out, like TV shows, books, like people really started to sort of meditate on what the Canadian identity actually was because we didn't really have one. And in the 60s was when we first got our national anthem and our national flag. And I actually pulled up a quote from Margaret Atwood because I thought people would be likely to know her. She's quite a famous Canadian author. But she said in 1972, I started reading Canadian literature when I was young, though I didn't know it was that. In fact, I wasn't aware that I lived in a country with any distinct existence of its own. At school, we were being taught to sing Rule Britannia and to draw the Union Jack. After hours, we read stacks of Captain Marvel, Plastic Man, and Batman comic books. And so there's really been this sort of long-standing, over the past like 50 or 60 years, battle, I guess, to sort of wrest the Canadian identity away from the influencing forces around us. World War II hasn't been a huge chunk of that, I guess. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of it.
That's super interesting because I also was wondering if it was kind of like the Dutch are like super direct and stuff, but I feel like the Canadians maybe aren't as like boasty specifically as America is. America's a little boasty, right?
I don't know. So often when the Canadians were involved in like various battles, they ended up being sent in as shock troops or whatever. I don't remember who it was, but there was someone in the German brass who referred to the Canadian troops as the Allied stormtroopers, basically as saying, oh, the Canadians are like, we don't want to go up against them. And those little things become a huge part of us being like, well, we don't have to brag because we know that we were a really small, effective fighting force. And not to brag, but we were there and did these important things.
And the second you guys get proud, it's the definition of humble bragging. We kind of do it, but just quietly.
Definitely people, I would say, are proud of Canada's accomplishments in the war. If you ask someone if their grandfather served, they'll happily tell you and that kind of stuff. But it's really not the cornerstone the way it is in the States.
How about you, Other Sam?
It's actually very similar in the Philippines as well because there is this huge grappling of what is the Filipino identity. I mean, if you look at the geography of the Philippines, we're a bunch of islands and a bunch of the provinces are very much isolated. In that, there's, when you ask a person, like if you ask somebody from Manila, what is it to be a Filipino? It's very different from the answer of people who are in Mindanao or in Visayas, or even in the same like island group, Luzon, where Manila is. It's very different in Northern Luzon or Central Luzon. So there definitely is always like this grappling of the idea of Filipino identity. And that World War II really is like, we don't care. I won't say we don't care, but there definitely is a whole, we're not going to touch that part of history because the Spanish colonization is 400 years compared to the 3 years that we were pulled into World War II. And then 40 years under American rule compared to the 3 years we were under Japanese rule. And then obviously martial law lasted for like 20 to 30 years, right? So there's so much time. World War II is such a small hunk of what happened to us, of the tragedies that have happened to us, that a lot of people just, if you look at Philippine cinema, there really is not that much about World War II that is on the scale that Hollywood creates. I mean, there is one. Currently, there's a show coming out that is produced by one of the big networks here in the Philippines, GMA. It's called Pulang Araw, or The Red Sun in English, and it follows 5 people and their families throughout World War II. And it's coming out on Netflix on July 25, I think, for anybody who's interested. But yeah, so far, that is the only World War II media that has come out very recently that is, grounded in the consequences of the war. Because every other film that came out about World War II were horror films. So there's In My Mother's Skin, which follows a family going through. It's a lot of body horror and a family having to survive in the midst of World War II whilst they're starving, etc., etc. Then there's another film called Seclusion, which was after World War II, about a bunch of priests who are suffering from trauma from World War II and are now having to battle this demonic entity. So there are films on World War II, but they're sort of grounded in sort of, if not fantasy and horror, in order to sort of like poetically talk about the message of how bad World War II was for us. Then it is drama, and like Ora Plata Mata, as we have talked about a while ago, it usually follows a family. It shows the before World War II, and then it shows during World War II, and then it shows the after World War II. And that's usually like the gist of World War II media of the Philippines.
Would you say that World War II is more of a backdrop to the movies than them being more actually about World War II? Because it sounds like it.
Yeah, it does. When you think about World War II, as other Sam said, as Sam said about Canada, wherein like the idea of national identity is not so ingrained in World War II. For us, it's the Spanish occupation. So we have a lot of films about the Spanish occupation, as well as the Philippine-American War that have recently come out and have been talked about recently. So those were the ones where it's very much rooted, because these things are very much rooted in the question of what is Filipino identity now. Philippine cinema is more interested in interrogating the Spanish occupation and the American occupation than it is interrogating World War II. Because World War II, I mean, if you look at it, World War II is so straightforward. We were colonized by the Japanese. We were used and abused by the Japanese. That's it. There's no Japanese culture that ever permeated us to the point wherein we're having an identity crisis. There's no, like, the only thing I think I remember about Japanese culture that really permeates, like, my everyday life is we call bottle caps, the glass bottles of Coke, the thing that you flip the bottle caps, we call them tansan, because there's a Japanese brand of beer, I think, or soda that was manufactured here that was called tansan. And then we just sort of adapted that phrase to talk about the bottle caps. If you think about it, the only thing we need from Japan are reparations, because they haven't paid it yet.
Yes.
That's it. That's it. We need acknowledgement for the sexual slavery that they put our women through. That's all we need from Japan. It's very straightforward. But if you ask a Filipino, what's your relationship with the Spanish culture that permeates Philippine culture and sets you aside from all of Southeast Asia, that's when you're like, oh, that's a very nuanced conversation that a lot of Philippine cinema would rather interrogate. Though I do remember there being another movie that came out that sort of harks back to the idea of anti-Semitism, because during the 1940s, our president of the Commonwealth, Manuel L. Quezon, he had Jewish friends. He also felt a kinship to the Jewish people and what was going on in Germany. So he did have a program where he allowed in 1,000 Jewish refugees into the Philippines. And there was a film that was made about that. It's called Quezon's Game. And it's in English, but I don't know where you can find it. I just remember seeing it in films. That was also very propaganda-y. I remember thinking
Sure.
It definitely was a whole like benevolence. And I mean, like, I don't doubt that Manuel L. Quezon wanted to save these people, but it just felt very, that fuzzy feeling of like, oh, he did something good. Like that thing of like, oh yeah, something's up here. But yeah, that's also another film that came out, not recently, but like probably 5 or 6 years ago, about World War II. But then again, it just never touches on like what Japan did. It's really more pre-World War II Battle of Manila sort of thing. But yeah, in Philippine cinema or Philippine media, apart from what's going to come out later on in this month, it's almost never touched on. And if it is touched on, it's never about soldiers. It is always about the Filipino family or the everyday Filipino civilian, the ones that were left behind, not even about the Filipino guerrilla movement that was our primary way of fighting back, the women guerrillas who went against the Japanese. There's so many stories like that, but they're never really mythologized or never really put into media because it's just not what Philippine cinema is interested in.
Yeah, Ora Plata Mata was really like the war, they weren't participants. The war was something that happened to them. It was very different than we're active participants in this.
Yeah. The new one that's coming out, Pulang Araw, it has several soldier characters in it. So I'm very interested to see what happens or how they depict that. Because they also have one Japanese Filipino soldier in it, which is interesting. It's because there were in existence Japanese Filipino families, but that's never a perspective that's ever interrogated or looked into. So I'm interested in what's going to happen in the new series. But yeah, just World War II is never something, it's never a part of our history. I think the way that it is just, it's so straightforward that we don't seem to have any need to interrogate it.
Mart, do you want to talk a bit about Germany?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting to dive into briefly some myth-making in Germany, because Germany was, at least in Europe, the aggressor. And there's a couple of myths, but the one I find the most interesting is the one that was perpetuated for a long time after the war, was that the Wehrmacht, which is just a common army, had no involvement in the persecution of Jews. I found this video on YouTube by a historian, I think. He's German and his channel is called The Hipstorian, and he has this video titled The Complicated History of the Clean Wehrmacht Myth, and it's a really interesting video. The myth basically suggests that the common soldier had little or no role in the persecution and execution of Jews. And there are some interesting things about this video, because there were soldiers in the German army that had no political motivations. And in general, the German soldiers were more moved by following orders and doing their jobs. That was a thing that was actually true for most of the Germans. But in this video, this guy tells us that the platoon leaders in the German army did know about the murder of Jews, and they helped getting them from place to place and stuff like that. And apparently these platoon leaders banned photography and mentions of the crimes committed in letters home, but a lot of the soldiers did write home and take photographs, which is how we know that the Wehrmacht were actually involved. And another really interesting source was that there were these British prisoner of war camps that had Germans wiretapped, and they listened to them as they talked to each other about stuff that had happened to them and stuff that they witnessed. And they had differing opinions about this too. Some of them convicted it and others didn't, so they spoke candidly about this and they didn't know they were being wiretapped. So it's an interesting conversation to hear. They'd seen some awful stuff, and some of them didn't care about it and others thought it was horrible. So they were very different. There were many different soldiers with many different motivations. Some of them were clearly idealizing the Nazi ideas, and others didn't have as much of an interest and even condemned it. It's not all that black and white for the Germans either, I guess.
And I think when we hear a story like that, we have to consider what would be someone's motivation for telling that story. And of course, if you are German, you are descended from people who participated in World War II. And so it is politically expedient for the government, and certainly probably makes a lot of people feel better to think that, like, while the ordinary German soldier was not involved in this massive infrastructure that existed in order to exterminate Jews and other undesirable people in the Third Reich. So even just the nature of the story, it's like, well, of course, like that can't be true, you know?
No. And I'm sure there were a couple of soldiers who didn't know, but I guess most of them would know. And they would just pretend not to know.
Right. It's funny, I read an article yesterday and I wish I could remember which one it was because I read like a million of them. But they were talking about how there were all these interviews with American GIs because this idea of the clean Wehrmacht became very pervasive pretty much immediately, I guess, after the war. And it was funny because if you talk to like the average American GI, they were like, no, everyone is trying to tell us that the only real bad guys were the SS. But it's like, we barely saw the SS. There weren't really that many of them. And it's like, how could the Wehrmacht not have been participating in that? Like the average American GI knew that like that had to be the case.
And the platoon leaders, they were the lawmakers. So they could decide that certain crimes weren't crimes anymore. So sure, they knew what they were doing. The German army was so large too, like it would just be impossible not to know.
And even if they didn't know, I guess it's safe to say that they definitely did participate in the culture that pushed that genocide. We're brought up in a world that already is very much biased against people of color, against Black people particularly. So obviously we have internal biases within us that every one of us has to sort of overcome. And I think Germany at the time was not a good place to interrogate your own biases and interrogate your own prejudices. So obviously, even if you weren't actively participating in anti-Semitism, there definitely was a culture that pushed that genocide. So they would have definitely been roiled in that.
And Hitler's anti-Semitism began long before the war started. In Germany, Jewish people were run out of their stores and their stores were destroyed. And there were signs in the street saying no Jews long before the actual war started. So if they didn't know, they were kind of blind.
Well, and I think too, if you look at that kind of myth, a lot of the stories that become pervasive since the war, you have to look at how pretty much immediately after World War II, West Germany became an ally of the United States. So, and even during the war, when Hollywood was pumping out these war movies, etc., there was this sense or this belief like, well, we don't want to come down too hard on these guys because like there is going to be an after the war at some point. And we can't like really destroy people's belief in the humanity of these people because eventually who knows what's going to happen. West Germany became an ally of the United States. Very quickly, Japan became an ally of the United States because they were a country that was not communist, cheek by jowl up against China and Russia, right? And so it was really politically expedient in the United States to accept and propagate these stories of, okay, well, maybe Germany and Japan were not all bad, you know?
Yeah, there's also another thing the historian mentions in the video. He was a lot from research done by another historian. I can't remember his name, but he researched something where the older generation of Germans that were in the Wehrmacht were more opposed to the extreme views of Hitler than, say, the younger generation was, because they were basically interned with the Nazi ideology. A lot of these German boys grew up just being brainwashed by the Nazi ideology. But very interesting. I would go watch the video if you have 30 minutes to spare.
Yeah. Hopefully as we move through our podcast, we'll get a chance to watch a lot more movies from other countries, because this has sort of just made me really curious. I want to know how any country that was involved used World War II and how they tell those stories.
One of the things on our list is a German TV show, or a 3-parter actually.
Oh, is that the one about the 4 friends?
I think it's called Generation War in English.
I saw a trigger warning list and I was like, maybe not yet.
Yeah, and this YouTuber also mentions that how it tries to show the German perspective, but then also isn't brave enough to show the bad stuff as much as they should. So I'm looking forward to watching it.
Yeah, I think even this long after World War II, the Germans still have a pretty fraught relationship with what happened. I mean, obviously.
You would, yeah.
Yeah, and obviously they've made it a point to teach the Holocaust in schools and be very, this happened and we did this, which is great. But obviously, if you're making media about it, it's just, man, it is so hard to tread that line of how do we tell this story without making apologies for the things that people did? Like, how do we humanize these people without like giving them too much credit and like kind of stuff? Like, it's such a hard line to walk.
I think in the show, and I'll have to confirm when I actually watch it, but I think it kind of passes them by a little because they're like common people. They don't start out as soldiers. I think 1 or 2 of them join the military, but the other 3 don't.
I think from what I remember, one of them is either gay or Jewish. And then
One of them is Jewish, yeah, sure.
yeah, him. And then the other one was in the military. And then the girl was a nurse in the military.
Yeah.
And there was the fourth one was like a bar singer. I don't remember if there
Yeah.
were 4 or 5 of them.
5, I think, because 2 of them are brothers, I think. But, well,
yeah.
doesn't matter. We'll talk about it when we watch the show eventually with our friend Anna.
It's actually so interesting to see Germany's approach to World War II because Japan's approach to World War II is so vastly different in that Japan likes to pretend that it never happened. They sort of erase or completely and utterly turn a blind eye to what they did to China, to Korea, to India, Southeast Asia. It's so vastly different from Germany. When I look at Germany's way of acknowledging World War II, I'm like, the bar is on the ground. You know what I mean? Like, Japan is so insidiously silent, the way that they've managed to erase it, not just from the world's memory, but also from the memory of the Japanese people. Every time I look at Japanese World War II media, it's all about their honor. It's all about the atomic bomb, which, by the way, bad, terrible, awful. Caveat needs to be said. The disclaimer needs to be said. Not a good look, America. But it definitely is like when you look at World War II media about Japan, definitely is about what they suffered, which, in fairness, they suffered a lot from American bombings and the atomic bomb, but never really about the destruction that they wrought on other countries.
Well, we just covered the movie Tora, 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 which is a retelling of the events leading up to Pearl Harbor from both the American perspective and the Japanese perspective. And they actually had a Japanese production team working on the Japanese side. So Japanese directors, Japanese writers, all that stuff. And we touched on this. We said it's super interesting how all of the Japanese people are portrayed as very reluctant to go to war. And they have these imperialist goals, but they don't want to go to war unless they absolutely have to. And just this reluctance to take responsibility for anything that happened, even at that point, 25 years after the war ended.
It's very similar, especially like now when I think about it. Like I've said before, a lot of Filipinos are definitely still asking for reparations, particularly for comfort women and the sexual slavery that went on during the Japanese occupation. And I was talking to a historian friend of mine, and he was talking about how it's the way Japan is handling it. It's almost like they're waiting for all the comfort women to die because they're all so very old now. But if you talk to them, like the trauma is still very fresh. It's almost as if they're waiting for these women to die just so that they can just continue pretending not to look at it. And then there was this controversy during the late 2010s where the Filipino comfort woman statue commemorating the horror of that moment was taken down at the Japanese government's behest. And it's like, oh, okay, so we're definitely still actively erasing a part of your history, I guess. Yeah, it's very easy to forget from the colonizer's point of view.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's interesting too, like what you had said about waiting for them to die. It's like, once people are gone, you can tell whatever stories you want about them, and people can't speak for themselves. So let's go to our conclusion. Sam, we let our last guests recommend their favorite topical books. So do you have any books or movies or anything that you want to recommend to the audience?
Yeah, on the subject of myth making, I definitely do recommend a Filipino author, particularly in Filipino myth making. It's called A Question of Heroes, and it's by Nick Joaquin. Joaquin. He's a poet laureate here in the Philippines, one of my favorite. And that's like the premier book about like Filipino myth making. And it talks about the groups of men mostly behind Filipino independence from the Spanish as well as from the Americans. And then obviously the latest show that's coming out later this month, July 25, I think, or 24 or 26. Called Pulang Araw, which is about World War II. It has some of my favorite actors ever in it. So it's going to be fun. Watch and definitely do a deep dive into.
Also, what we can do maybe, as I know that Sam has a pretty extensive list of Filipino war media. So maybe we could share that. We could put a link or something in the show notes or on our website or something like that.
I think we could definitely do it on the website. Yeah, it would be good.
Yeah, it's a Tumblr post, so it's messy. But
Would you mind us linking to your post, or
it's
would you
fine.
rather?
At this point, you know what? I have no shame. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. Editing Marcia here. It's been a while since we've recorded this podcast, but Sam has come back to give us more book recommendations. And they are awesome, so I'm gonna insert those here, and you can look those up if you're interested in Filipino World War II stories.
My recommendations for Philippine history books would be A History of the Philippines by Luis H. Franca, for your basic Philippine history stuff from the very beginning to probably until martial law or the 1980s at least. The historian Ambeth Ocampo is also very good at making Philippine history accessible to the everyday reader. He has a series of books also tackling the subject of Filipino identity through Philippine mythmaking, like Bones of Contention and Rizal Without the Overcoat. He's also an old professor of mine, so shout out to him. He's really great, actually. And if you want like specific Philippine history books, specifically for World War II, I suggest a couple. I suggest Amazons of the Hook Rebellion by Vina A. Lanzona. This is a book about the women that led certain parts of the Hukbalahap guerrilla warfare during World War II against the Japanese. And then War and Resistance in the Philippines from 1942 to 1944 by James K. Morningstar. And then another book about the Philippines, this time from 1940, I think, to 1945. This is more like primary sources, and it's set in chronological order. This was by Walter F. Bell. And then you have another one. This is more like in general Philippine history, but there are some parts of it that are really good for Philippine history during World War II. It's called Under the Stacks by Sol, we say Sol Holfilina Jr. And then there's another book that I recommend. It's Awaiting MacArthur's Return, The World War II Guerrilla Resistance Against the Japanese by James Villanueva. And this one I think is more recent. I remember reading it though for classes, so I'm not really sure. But it's called Philippines' Resistance by Stacy Ann Baterina Salinas and Clyde Tizu. So I hope I'm saying that right. I'm not entirely sure you can say her first name. But yeah, that one's also very good. It's about the guerrilla resistance. As I've said before, they were the primary first line of defense of the Filipinos during World War II. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you for listening to our second episode about mythmaking. Special thank you to our very special guest Sam from the Philippines for your lovely insights. Those were really great. We'll be back next week with a discussion about La Vita è Bella, or Life is Beautiful, which I'm really looking forward to. And until then, you can follow our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like us, you can rate us 5 stars. And you can also rate us on IMDb now, which is pretty cool. But if you want to talk to us more directly, you can find us on Insta at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. And if you really can't wait for next week, you can also visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com. And we'll see you next week. Bye!